What shape would it make if you made a factor cube with a number with 4 prime factors?
Oh, excellent question. Do you have an idea of what it might make? Well,
lots of lines.
Yes, it would have lots of lines, and this is an excellent thing for you to try at home if you're interested. So because we had 3 prime factors, it made a cube because a cube has 3 dimensions, and we get 1 more dimension for every new prime factor that we have. So it's going to make a 4-dimensional cube, otherwise known as a tesseract. And if you try and draw one of those, you can try and draw it by, there are various ways you can try and draw it. You can draw it by understanding what a cube is. That's one way. You can look it up on the internet. That's another way. Or you can do it by understanding all the factors of something that's got 4 prime factors. So the smallest one will be 2 times 3 times 5 times 7, which is 210. If you write down all the factors of 210, and then you do the hierarchy like we did, starting with 1 and then having prime factors, and then things that are a product of 2, and then a product of 3 prime factors, and finally 210 at the top, and then you draw the arrows between them, you will actually have drawn a 4-dimensional cube.
Yeah, I think in the back row there's this.
Hi there. A bit more abstract this time. Does logic enlighten us to understand concepts such as, or terms such as good and evil, or good and bad?
Interesting question. I think that it, first of all, I would claim that it enlightens us about everything. I think that if we are able to use very powerful logic, then we can think about what things we consider to be good, and then we can split it up into different types of good and different types of evil, and then we could have multiple dimensions because there are a lot of different ways you can be good, and then we can also understand that you can do good and also do bad simultaneously. And one of the things I talk about in the book actually is how there's too much black and white thinking. And so, for example, when we're evaluating a world leader, we have a tendency to say, this person was terrible, or this person was a hero, and then we get into fights about whether that person was terrible or whether they were great. When in fact, most people do some things that are great and some things that are terrible. And some people do more things that are terrible. But even the people who did the most terrible things have sometimes started out by doing something that was quite good, but we're sort of not allowed to say it anymore because that's like ignoring the fact that they did all these terrible things later. It's not a very nuanced way of thinking about things. So I think I would say, in the end, yes, by using both long chains of logical deduction, splitting things up into different dimensions of things contributing to good and evil, and also by thinking about grey areas and not just separating into a strict black and white dichotomy between good and evil.
Okay, so can you keep your hands up for a little bit so I can work out a mental map of questions and where they can end up? Yep.
Hello. I was wondering, do you think that it's possible to map consciousness on a mathematical term?
Oh, well, some people are working on this. And so, is it possible to map consciousness in mathematical terms? So category theory is being applied very widely to things far beyond where it first imagined it would be applied. Category theory grew up in the 1940s and 50s, specifically to understand some very abstract part of mathematics in homology theory, which is very abstract. But now it's being used to understand neural networks and also natural language processing, and also how the brain works and how linguistics work. And so I think I would say yes, as long as you can think about making clear definitions in the first place. So one of the things that mathematics encourages and almost forces us to do is to be very clear about the definitions of things we're starting with. Because if we're not clear about the definitions, then we can't make logical deductions at all. And it's one of the things that can make mathematicians seem pedantic when they're starting to have arguments, because we always want to be clear what our definitions are. But it's one of the reasons that we are able to be unambiguous and have sensible arguments, because we start by agreeing on some definitions. And that's a really important part of mathematics. It's also what can make maths lectures really boring, because the kind of lecturer who just stands at the board and writes definition, theorem, proof, definition, theorem, proof. But it is really important, and arguments often go wrong just because of basic definitions. And one I see a lot, especially in America at the moment, is when people talk about immigration, and some people really think that all immigrants are illegal. and that whenever they say immigrant, they are thinking illegal immigrant in their head, and they refuse to concede that there is such a thing as a legal immigrant. And that complete confusion about basic definitions means there's no hope of having a logical argument until we've actually sorted those things out. So the thing that might impede, to get back to the point, that might impede using this to study consciousness is, can we pin down definitions about consciousness, and can we even agree on definitions about consciousness enough to start with? Maybe we can.
Okay,
I'm an optimist.
Thank you. So you've set out this ideal cycle where logic and emotions work together.
Yes.
And you've also said that in the face of strong emotions, it's a human condition that logic tends to go out the window, and you gave that kind of fear example. Do you not think that this cycle actually requires you to apply a degree of rational logic in order to make it kind of work? So in the face of a topic which evokes strong emotions, such as the US election, this cycle almost gets rendered useless because people can't then apply logic to that situation.
It's a good point. So when I say that emotions are usually stronger than logic, what I mean is that if we don't take it very far, then yes, the emotions will win. But if we are able to take a little step back, so it's one of those things where you only have to take a little step back, and then maybe you can override a little bit of the emotions, then you can take a little step further back. And one example of this, I managed to get myself out of a very profound fear of flying by... I couldn't do it for ages. People kept telling me, oh, statistically, it doesn't make any sense. It's much more dangerous to get in a car. And so I thought really hard about where my fear was coming from. And all those people, basically those people were just invalidating me. And what I really wanted was for someone to say, yes, flying is terrifying. And then I could start actually feeling better about it. So I then analyzed very, very closely where my fear of flying came from. And after I'd analyzed it very closely, I realized I could find the part of it that was the weakest, and I could overcome that. So I realized that it was actually the sound of takeoff that made me terrified. So I sat down at home, I downloaded a recording of a jumbo jet taking off, and I just listened to it over and over again at home while sitting on my sofa so that I got used to it. And then that sound didn't make me afraid so much anymore. So I also know that it's about conditional probability, not probability. So everyone telling me the probabilities doesn't help. It's the conditional probability. Conditional probability is the probability of something happened given that something else has happened. And so it's the probability of dying given that your plane crashes, which is really quite high. Whereas if your car crashes, you might survive. And so the conditional probability is better, even though the overall probability. So that gave a logical basis to my emotions, and that actually enabled me to overcome my fear of flying, which is good because I fly an awful lot now to be able to talk to more people.
Okay, thank you. One from the top. And then...
I'm really blinded. Well,
yeah, just
hello.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the talk, really inspiring. I wanted to ask, how do you think all these factors will change over the next 50 years? Let's say, seeing that robots will dominate more by then.
Well, for a start, in 50 years' time, it's quite likely that many of us won't be here, but you will. And so it's really down to you. And the future is in your hands. So if you read my book, then I think it's going to be great. I think that there is a lot of fear about robots and artificial intelligence, and one thing I like to say is that some people are really afraid of artificial intelligence, whereas I'm more afraid of natural stupidity. But more seriously, I think that education does need to develop, and that if we carry on focusing a lot of our education on algorithms and repeating the things because our parents did it or because it's always been done like that, we're not going to be flexible enough to deal with the changes in the future. And so a more flexible approach is important. However, I read a lot of articles in newspapers by certain people saying that creativity is the thing that's going to be important once robots have taken over everything else, and therefore we should not focus on STEM fields because you can only learn creativity in the arts. So it sounds like you all agree with me, so I don't need to unpack the illogic of that statement any further.
Okay, we'll go over there.
So thank you very much. One of the words, down here, one of the words that you mentioned quite a lot was enlightenment.
Yes.
And I wondered if there was a shared definition of what enlightenment is and a way in which you test it to know that it's not fake.
Interesting. I wonder what you mean by fake. So first of all, for me, this is cyclic because enlightenment really means mathematical clarity. But clarity is just another word for enlightenment, isn't it? So what my emotional response is, enlightenment is when you feel less confused. And of course, you're right. There are different ways of feeling less confused. One is to be deluded, which is does probably not count as enlightenment. So I would go back to the idea of a framework where yes, like as you say, there should be some framework for testing whether you genuinely are enlightened or whether you're just deluded, like you had a drink or something, and suddenly everything seems completely clear. Or like when you prove a mathematical theorem just before you go to sleep and you think you're great, and then you wake up in the morning and you realize it was a complete load of nonsense. So I think that for me, the test is whether I am, there are many tests, in fact. There's are you able to use it to help other people? Are you able to explain it to other people? Are you able to use it to make progress with something? And if you are, what kinds of things then count as progress? So as you can see, I do these arguments in my head all the time to try and make sure that I am doing things with a framework. And for me, making progress often means figuring out what would be a good thing to do, because I like action. I don't like sitting around complaining about things. And I don't like just understanding things. I do like understanding things for their own sake, but I also like being able to do something to help the world. So for me, that's what enlightenment is. For other people, it might mean different things. So for some people, enlightenment will be a sudden idea for how to make tons of money. And although that would not count as enlightenment to me, that would count as enlightenment to them because they've made something that counts as progress to them, even though it wouldn't count to me. So I think the answer is maybe.
Hello. Thank you for your talk very much. So I have a question. So if you start, sorry, yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. So if you start with different assumptions, you're talking about these assumptions that then lead to a train of logic, that then you get this wonderful circle that you described. Do you think if you start with different axioms or different assumptions, do you think that you can still reach the same conclusions? Or does that circle even hold anymore if you have different assumptions? Will that change the logic entirely?
Great question. You definitely can reach the same conclusions from a different starting point. And just like you can all reach here today from starting in different places in London. And so there are people who, and this works both ways, so there are people who believe in the same types of political action, for example, even though they're doing it for different reasons. And so there are people who believe in something doing the right thing, and so they do this. But then there are other people who might do the same thing because it's going to make them more money. Or things like, there are people who believe that you should treat everybody kindly because that's a good thing to do, and there are people who believe you should treat other people kindly because otherwise you'll go to hell. And there are people who believe that you should treat everybody kindly because otherwise karma will come back and strike you. And in a way, it doesn't matter to me very much which of those things people believe, as long as they're all treating people kindly. So the other way around, you can start from similar beliefs and end up with wildly different ideas about how politics should go. So sometimes people with whom I wildly disagree politically actually turn out to be not that far away in their starting beliefs. Because if you change one belief a tiny bit, it's like a butterfly effect. It can go wildly out that way. And so I find this a really good way of finding more unity between people, understanding that even though our final conclusions might be wildly different, deep down over here, we might actually believe something very similar, and then we can work on reaching understanding better.
Okay. I think question from here. Well, curiously, I found out, you know the word butterfly effect? Originally, the person who wrote it, I think a guy called Lorentz, so his idea was that butterfly wings flapping in Texas or Brazil could cause a storm in Texas. He actually called it the seagull effect initially. But he thought seagull wasn't as cool as
I
butterfly.
see why you wanted to interject. Well, actually, now that you have interjected, I'm going to say one more thing, which is that in mathematics, there are often many different ways to axiomatize the same theory. So I don't know how much maths you know, but you may find later that there are a lot of different ways of making the definitions to reach the same thing. And often it's quite hard to tell that you have reached the same thing, but it's a really important part of maths, being able to start from different starting points and build the same structure, because it gives us more points of view on the same subject. And the more points of view we have on the same thing, the better. There is no one right point of view, I think, except that maybe mathematics. Okay, anyway.
Okay.
Eugenia, thank you for your talk. Very quick question. When teaching, do you find yourself starting with an abstraction and then using concrete examples to make it clearer? Or do you find yourself looking at patterns in reality and walking people towards that unifying principle?
It really depends on the students. So there is a very widely held view that you should start with examples and go to abstraction afterwards. But that doesn't work for the people who like abstraction and want to go to examples afterwards. And there is never one thing that works for everybody in teaching. The important thing is to understand your students and empathize with them and understand how they think. And so the first class with a new class is always very nerve-wracking because it's a bunch of people you've never met before. You have to get to know them really fast in order to help them understand anything. And then you can figure out what is the best way for them. And I know this because personally, I prefer abstraction first and examples afterwards, and that's just how I think. And it means I've sat through an awful lot of maths lectures where I've had to listen to it backwards because they start with all the examples and I can't understand them. So I have to wait until they do the abstraction at the end, and then I quickly unpack all the beginning of the examples that they had before, which is very tiring. And I actually once helped a 6-year-old at school who they thought she was really bad at adding things up. And so they'd given her these really helpful books to help her add up by adding up sweets and cookies and apples and monkeys. And I eventually realized that she could add up, she just couldn't do sweets and apples and monkeys. She could, when it was numbers, she was fine. And so I thought, oh, she's going to be a category theorist. But quite often when I'm giving something like a research talk where I haven't got time to necessarily understand the audience, I just ask them and I make it a choose your own adventure. So I say, do you want to do the examples first or do you want to do the abstraction first? And we take a vote. And it goes both ways, so it really depends.
Okay, we're going to go to the top and then we'll come back in a second.
Hi. So in like the search for like true artificial intelligence and things, like where they can actually like rationalize and like make logical decisions instead of like following like programmed algorithms. Do you think that category theory, because of like how like relationships and things, will be something that's useful in that?
Yes, I think it already is actually. Category theory is at the heart of some of the most modern programming languages, which is functional programming, where it's a much more efficient way of doing things, and it's much more error-free because it's structural and rather than procedural. And somehow when you fit structures together, it's like fitting a jigsaw puzzle together. When you're fitting a jigsaw puzzle together, you sort of can't do it wrong. You might not be able to do it right, but it won't fit together if you do it wrong. And category theory is a bit like that. So things either fit together or they don't. You can't kind of accidentally do it wrong and make a mess. And so I think from that point of view, it's already helping a lot with making a better code for systems, and I think that is at the basis of so much AI. I am going to say yes, I think it's going to help.
Okay, I've still got a couple more up there, then we'll come back down.
What inspired you to pursue your career in mathematics?
Well, I was very lucky because my mother, who is sitting over here, is somewhat mathematical, and she showed me some really cool things about maths when I was little that helped me to believe that maths was way more interesting than the stuff that we did at school. And that saw me all the way through, but I had to wait a really long time for it to become that interesting. And so there was nothing really as interesting as what my mother told me until I was doing my PhD, which is really tragic. You shouldn't have to wait that long if you happen not to have a mother who will show you those things. And that's why I decided not only to become a mathematician, but to write books for everybody in case they don't have a parent who will show them the coolest parts of math. So I'm going to be that person who will show it to everybody. In the meantime, let's change the entire education system. But that's a bit of a bigger project. So I stuck with writing books first.
Okay, you go.
Thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. I just wanted to ask, you have a virtuous cycle on the board here, and I just wanted to know, do you think that there could ever be a balance between logic and empathy, and what do you think this would look like? And do you think that as human beings, do you think that there's a part, either logic or empathy or both or neither, that is innate within us, or do you think it comes from our social interactions and our kind of environment?
That's a huge question. Thank you. So first of all, I think that I'm an optimist, so I believe that, yes, we could achieve a balance between logic and empathy. There are some really serious barriers to that at the moment, and one is education. I mean, one of the reasons I went into not just mathematics but education was because I do believe that education is the key to so many of these things. And as for whether it's innate or not, it's hard to say things like that because we can't exactly tell, but there's so much that we learn as we're going along. And in a way, if any of it was innate rather than learnt, it would be so impossible to tell that it's almost worthless trying to even talk about it, especially because I am generally averse to calling things innate because it gives people an excuse for not doing them, because they can just go, oh, well, I wasn't born that way. And so I think if we declare that empathy is something that you're born with, then it gives people a chance to say, oh, well, I just wasn't born that way, so there's no way I can do that. Now, maybe some people are better at it than others, as with all things, but we can all get better at it. And I think that we can all get better at anything. And I've definitely got better at empathizing with other people throughout my life, partly because some of my friends helped me. I remember one friend very distinctly telling me that I did that thing where as soon as she complained about anything, I offered a solution. She didn't want a solution. She wanted to be told that that was really awful, how terrible. And so I've borne that in mind, and now I notice when everyone does it to me, because they do all the time. But also by developing these techniques, by reading the comments of people I vehemently disagree with and trying to understand. It's like a kind of test I do on myself every day to make sure I get better at it. And I do believe I'm getting better at it because there are some points of view that I was unable to understand earlier in my life, and now I am able to understand them. So I think that we can all get better at it.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Cheng. Right here.
Hi.
Hi. You said that your goal is to cure the world of maths phobia.
Mm-hmm.
How will you know when you're done?
Well, there are many things, again. So when I meet people and say I'm a mathematician, their response is very telling. And they very often say, oh, I'm terrible at maths. Or, oh, I couldn't do maths. Or, I was fine with maths until the numbers turned to letters. Or, I was fine with maths until algebra. Or something. And so if people stop saying that to me, that will help. If people stop boasting about being bad at maths, if there stop being advertising campaigns for something where they just throw in some comment about being bad at maths, if there stop being media focus on people who are good at maths but somehow terrible at life, because I feel like that has maths phobia at its root, because they want to say, well, okay, fine, that person's good at maths, but I wouldn't want to be like that because they're terrible at making friends. And so that's unhelpful. These are all signs of maths phobia, I think. So maybe I'll never be done, but I'll pass on the task to people like our friends who've been asking these wonderful questions, and they'll carry it on, and we'll always achieve more and more and more, even if we never actually finish.
Right at the back.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
First of all, I think your talk is very inspiring, and I myself am inspired to become someone like you in the future.
Oh, thank you.
And my first question is, what is it that your mum taught you when she was young? I'm really curious to know.
The lady in the red top. Not the red one, yeah.
Well, one of the things, my earliest memory is when she told me about how you can draw a graph. Now, drawing graphs is something that makes some people shudder because you're made to draw graphs and in school and there's no particular point to it. But she showed me that if you draw a graph of x squared, the process of squaring turns into a picture. And that's amazing. And I don't think we emphasize this enough, that a process can be represented in a picture, and it looks like this. And I remember sitting in this big green armchair we had at home and feeling like my brain was contorting out of my skull about because I knew that 3 times 3 was 9 and 4 times 4 was 16 and stuff, but how could that be a picture? And I think that that is one of the things that is really key about maths, that these things are amazing. And the progress that was made to develop those things, it's like the idea of decimals that keep going forever without repeating themselves is extraordinary. And the idea of numbers that you can't express as a fraction, and the idea, these things are really amazing. So graphs are an incredible way of encapsulating tons of information in a really fantastic picture. And if you put it like that, then it becomes completely different from, oh, now plot a graph, now sketch a graph of this, oh no, you got the intercept in the wrong place, sketch a graph of that, oh no, it's the wrong way around. And that takes all the joy out of it. So I always held on to that. And the other early memory I have is when she taught me how you can add up all the numbers from 1 to 10 really quickly, because if you line up all the numbers from 1 to 10 and then underneath you line them all up backwards, then every pair adds up to the same thing. It adds up to 11, and then you can just take all 10 of them, which is easy, and then divide it by 2 because you've counted everything twice. And I just thought that was really cool. And I still think it's really cool. So those are my two earliest memories of things.
Thank you. So going back to curing maths phobia and your techniques for that, one of which is writing a book, I was wondering, a couple different books, 3 if I can count right. Have you looked at the people who read the books and if they identify as math phobic or not?
I have not done any studies of that, but I have talked to people. So one of the reasons I love doing events and people come and talk to me and I interact with people on Twitter is that a lot of them do say that they were previously math phobic, but now they've realized that they weren't really math phobic, they were just phobic of school maths. And I think that's fair. I think that being phobic of school maths is reasonable. And that if you realize that maths isn't just that, then that's a good start. And so I love hearing from people who said that. Of course, I don't hear, maybe they wouldn't write to me if they say, well, I used to have math phobia and I still do. Thanks a lot. But then again, people do write me the rudest emails. So I feel like that someone would have written that by now if that had really happened to them. Because they've said all sorts of stupid things, but no one has said that yet. So that's not an invitation to say that necessarily. But
ask you a question. I'm going to answer that question. My name is Carol Ahoyos, and I did the IB, and I did the IB math studies, but you could do the highest IB math, which is IB high, then you could do IB low, and for the people who really were math phobic, you did math studies. I read your book. We went to see you at MoMath with my son, and with these 2 amazing women, we started a charity which had its first competition last week called Maths Teams, and we use exactly some of the things your mom taught you to be your mom for primary school children between 9 and 10. And that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't asked me to, if I hadn't known how to juggle, because you asked me to juggle to show math grades. And I was the one who walked across the moment. And so I read your book, and as we did, and started math teams. And our mission is to create as many math teams in the UK as there are football teams. So there you go.
Thank you very much.
What advice would you give to a child who's maths phobic now? And whose head is full of creative and interesting and logical thoughts about the world, including the logical
Asking for a friend.
Including the logical thought that we have calculators for school maths and times tables.
So I am a big fan of calculators. I use my calculator all the time. And my teachers at school used to say, you know, you won't always have a calculator with you. Well, I say ha ha to them. And I think what I would say, if there were such a person, is it that the classes, is it the lessons at school that are really boring? And if it is the lessons at school that are really boring, then I sympathize, because they really are boring. And it's not your teacher's fault, it's the fault of the curriculum and the people who make policy and the people who impose standards and try to make league tables and put pressure on and withhold financial and blah, blah, blah. But to try and believe that that's not what maths actually is, and that it's fine to be phobic of your lessons at school, and however, if you can hold out hope that there is something else out there. So my example of this is that we had dance lessons at school as part of PE, and I was never that great. I never really liked PE for some of the same reasons that people don't like maths, which is that I turned out to be not very good at it, and then no one really helped me get any better, and people made me feel stupid for not being able to throw and catch a ball and things like that. But dance was particularly terrible because it consisted of a teacher picked a really awful piece of electronic music that was terrible, and then taught us a choreography of it and made us memorize these steps. And I could probably still remember the steps because she drummed them into us so hard. And I hated those lessons, but I managed to understand that that's not what dancing is about. That was just dance lessons. And I didn't go away and go, oh, I hate dance, it's not creative, it's just about following a bunch of rules. I still understood that dancing doesn't have to be like that, and that dancing can be creative and expressive once you're released from the confines of that class. So I would say maths is like that too. And there are so many wonderful resources, books and resources on the internet everywhere where you can explore things yourself and try and hold out hope that unfortunately, yes, we have to get through those things at school. But also, if you don't manage to pass those things at school, then it might not be a complete disaster, because there are plenty of people. So on the other hand, there are people who say, oh, I failed maths at school and I'm doing great. So that's not a great thing to say either. But it's not the be-all and end-all of everything. And there are many people who turn out to be really good at real maths, even though they weren't that great at school. And there are examples of people who became really successful mathematicians, who win prizes and are professors, even though they failed maths loads of times at school. And so there is always hope.
Okay, one last quick, we've got a minute left, one last question.
I just wanted to say I was really interested to see how many women there are in the audience, and I was wondering how you found being a mathematician and a woman. I also studied pure and applied mathematics at university. And it was quite rare in those days. And how often do you have to deal with people telling you that you can't possibly be as smart as a male mathematician?
Well, it was very rare. When I was an undergraduate, there was about 1 in 10 people were women. And when I was a PhD student, it was even lower than that. And there are some advantages. For example, at the first conference I went to, there were more female toilets than female participants. So we never had to wait. In fact, we could have one each and one spare. But also, I realized much later in life that I grew up being very used to being different from everyone in the room, because we were basically the only Chinese people in Sussex, practically, at the time. And so I was always the only non-white person. Everyone was white at school. All the teachers were white. And so I sort of got used to just looking different. And so when I also became the only female person in a room full of men, I realized it didn't feel that different to me. And so for a while, I didn't believe it was an issue. And I think that's quite common sometimes I read an article saying that younger women at the beginning of their careers often don't notice those things because they just think, oh, I'm junior, no one's going to respect me. And then as you become more senior, you realize you're not getting any more respect. And then you start going, hey, wait a minute, I'm not junior anymore. And this is somewhat what happened to me, where when I started my career, it was never the research community, but it was more the universities and the sort of more political aspect of it, where I thought, well, no one's listening to me, but I'm new and I'm the youngest person here. And then after a few years, I was no longer new and I wasn't the youngest person there. And there were all these new younger people who happened to be white men, and they were saying the same things that I said, but everyone listened to them and they didn't listen to me. And I thought, I wonder what's going on here. And I'm not one to just immediately jump on it and go, oh, well. And I didn't know if they were being ageist, sexist, or racist. And so instead of sticking around to find out, I just left. And so now that's why I have more of a freelance career, where I thought, if I am going to look different, I might as well make use of it, because if that means I'm somehow memorable, that I can put myself out there and people will remember me. And that's the other thing at conferences, everyone always remembers me, because I'm the only one who looks like this. And it's a bit embarrassing, because I can't remember. I mean, all white guys look the same to me. And so they...
So thank you all for your wonderful questions. Eugenia will be outside signing books. and I'm going to get my book signed as well. It's amazing having. I've seen Eugenia's talks on YouTube, and she's so enthusiastic about maths. Actually, a role model for me. So it's wonderful to come and see you in person as well. So a wonderful round of applause to the amazing Dr. Eugenia Cheng.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.